They were only teenagers, but in the eyes of their enslavers they weren't children. They were property. And property had no innocence, no protection, and no voice. In the stillness of dawn, before the sun rose over the fields, young hands reached for tools too heavy for their age. The air was thick with silence, except for the faint sound of chains dragging against dirt. Some of them were barely 13, their faces marked by exhaustion that didn't belong to youth. Childhood had been stolen, replaced by obedience, labor, and fear. Behind the image of civility and southern grandeur was another story, one of innocence twisted into servitude. The white pillars of plantation houses hid the cries of those who never had a chance to grow up. For the enslaved, adolescence was not a phase of discovery. It was a sentence. They were called boys and girls, yet treated as full-grown laborers. They were sold as strong stock, praised for endurance, and punished when they faltered. They learned to read pain before they ever learned to read words. For them, every sunrise brought the same command: survive. In 18th and 19th century America, especially across the Deep South, plantations thrived under the illusion of order and grace. Cotton and tobacco fueled an empire, but the true cost was measured in human suffering. The wealth of the South was built not on the land alone, but on the backs of those born into captivity, children born already bound by ownership. From Virginia to Louisiana, every plantation had its rules, and every rule began with one belief: an enslaved child was not a child at all. The law saw no difference between a man and a boy, a woman and a girl. Both could be bought, sold, punished, or used at the master's will. Imagine being 14, forced to labor under the same heat and lash as grown men. Imagine being 15, carrying the weight of someone else's world on your shoulders, while being told you were blessed to be protected by the very people who owned you. They were told it was their duty to serve, that obedience was salvation. Every lesson they learned was built on control. And for those who disobeyed, punishment was swift and public, meant to teach others what resistance would cost. For teenage boys, the expectation was strength. They were molded to become tools of endurance, bodies designed for the fields, minds trained to silence. They were often forced to watch violence inflicted on their families, a warning of what awaited if they ever rebelled. They grew up fast, not because they wanted to, but because fear demanded it. For teenage girls, the weight of oppression carried another layer. They were valued not only for their labor but for their bodies, seen as future breeders, as property capable of producing more property. Their humanity was reduced to function. The system had no mercy for youth, no respect for innocence. Within the great houses, some were chosen for special service. They polished silver, dressed the mistress, or served the master. These positions were called privileges, but for many, they were prison's silent corridors of control where every move, every glance was monitored. There was no safety, no boundary, no choice. In public, the enslavers preached morality, decency, and faith. In private, they practiced domination and hypocrisy. The same voices that quoted scripture on Sunday were the same voices that justified cruelty on Monday. Plantation life was built on illusion, whitewashed words masking black suffering. The young learned early that truth was dangerous. They watched, listened, and endured in silence. They carried their pain deep inside, where no overseer could reach it. For them, survival was not just physical, it was psychological. To live another day meant hiding their rage, their grief, their hope. The legal codes of slavery made no exception for age. A child could be whipped, chained, or sold, and no law would intervene. To the system, they were assets, numbers on a ledger, value on a market. Traders described them not by name, but by weight, height, and health. Humanity had been replaced by profit. There are letters and documents that still exist, written by those who oversaw the business of bondage. They speak of good breeding stock, of healthy young field hands, and strong, obedient boys. Between those lines lies the truth of what slavery really was, an industry built on the destruction of childhood. When you strip away innocence, when you turn a child into property, you don't just break a body, you fracture the human spirit. And yet, even in the midst of darkness, there were sparks of resistance. The young whispered songs of hope when they were alone, hidden prayers for freedom that the wind carried through the night. Some tried to escape, others fought back, and many simply endured, not out of weakness but out of strength too deep for words. Every breath they took in defiance of their captors was an act of rebellion. They were taught they had no worth, but they held on to the truth that could not be erased. That they were human, no matter what the laws said, no matter how much pain they endured. When childhood becomes a memory before it begins, the soul forgets how to feel safe. But even then, it remembers how to survive. There are stories that were never written, only whispered. Stories of fear and silence, passed from one generation to the next. Among them, the hidden truths of how power corrupted not just the system, but the very souls who enforced it. Inside the walls of the plantation house, hierarchy and hypocrisy ruled side by side. Those who claimed to be men of God were often men of darkness. They used faith to justify domination, using verses as weapons to keep the enslaved obedient. And for the young, this contradiction became their first lesson about the world. That the people who spoke of virtue could be the same ones who inflicted pain. Teenage boys were often seen as threats, strong enough to rebel, too young to understand submission completely. The overseers watched them closely, breaking them down through constant labor, public punishment, and humiliation. The goal was clear: destroy their will before it had a chance to rise. Some were forced to watch the whipping of others, to learn that compassion was a weakness. Fear became their teacher. Survival meant obedience. For the girls, the burden was different, but no less cruel. They were trained to serve in the house, to move quietly, to keep their eyes low. Their innocence made them vulnerable to the power that surrounded them. The same hands that fed them could strike them. The same voices that called them child could also command them into silence. And when the abuse came, there was nowhere to run, because even the world outside the plantation refused to see them as victims. No one protected them. Not the law, not the church, not even time, because history would go on to erase their pain, pretending it never happened. The teenage years that should have been filled with growth and discovery became years of endurance. Some were forced into marriages arranged by enslavers to encourage population growth. Others were sold away at 15, separated forever from the only family they knew. Letters from slave traders described the value of young, healthy girls, boys of breeding age, as though life itself could be measured in coin. The horror of this system was not just in the violence, it was in the normalization of it. Those in power convinced themselves that this was order, that this was the way the world was meant to be. They dressed cruelty in the language of civilization, and generations accepted it as truth. But among the enslaved, memory was resistance. Every whispered song, every shared story, every hidden glance between two young people who still dared to feel love. It all became a quiet act of defiance. They found ways to hold onto pieces of themselves. A carved piece of wood, a hidden trinket, a lullaby sung under the stars, tiny fragments of humanity in a world determined to erase it. These acts may have seemed small, but to those who lived them, they were everything. They were proof that no amount of cruelty could fully own a soul. Some of the enslaved teenagers grew into rebels, their pain transforming into rage, their silence into fire. The same boys who were whipped for standing tall would one day join uprisings or flee through secret networks of resistance. The same girls who were silenced would later tell their stories, decades later, in trembling voices to interviewers who finally asked. When the Civil War ended, the system that had enslaved them collapsed on paper, but its shadow remained in the hearts of those who survived it. Many carried the scars not only on their skin, but deep in their minds. They had grown up believing that safety was a myth, that the world itself belonged to someone else. Even after freedom, some could not speak of what had been done to them. Their silence was not weakness, it was protection, because to tell the truth was to relive it. And yet, the truth endured. It survived in the memories of the elders who remembered being children in bondage. It lived in the trembling voices of former slaves who spoke to government interviewers in the 1930s. They recalled being whipped before they were tall enough to reach the plow. They remembered nights when they prayed for freedom, not for themselves, but for the generations to come. Their stories broke the silence that history tried to preserve. They exposed the hypocrisy of those who called themselves civilized. They made the world confront the unbearable truth that the wealth of a nation had been built on the destruction of its youngest souls. And as their voices echoed through time, one truth became impossible to ignore. The system had not just enslaved bodies. It had enslaved childhood itself. When the chains were finally broken, freedom came, but not healing. For many who had survived adolescence in bondage, freedom felt like walking out of a burning house only to find the world still on fire. They were free in name, yet haunted in spirit. They carried the weight of stolen youth, of memories too heavy to share. The fields they once worked became graveyards of their innocence. The houses where they had served now stood as monuments to hypocrisy. White pillars gleaming under the same sun that had once burned their backs. In the decades after emancipation, former slaves began telling their stories, haltingly, painfully, often through tears. Some spoke of being taken from their parents before they could remember their faces. Others remembered the nights of dread, when footsteps in the corridor meant danger, not safety. The Federal Writers Project of the 1930s recorded hundreds of these testimonies. Old voices, once silenced by law, finally told what no history book had dared to print. They spoke of teenage years stolen by cruelty, of masters who preached salvation while inflicting torment, of overseers who treated punishment as a sport. And though their words were quiet, they cut deeper than any weapon. Because behind every statistic of slavery stood a child, a boy or girl whose laughter had been turned into silence. For centuries, the world had celebrated the grandeur of plantations, the wealth they produced, the elegance of Southern society. But those marble staircases were built upon bodies. The perfume of power was mixed with the stench of blood and sweat. Behind every portrait of a smiling family in fine clothes, there was a missing child, a soul traded for comfort. Modern historians now unearth those truths that polite history tried to bury. They find bills of sale listing a girl, aged 14, alongside livestock. They find letters where slaveholders negotiated the price of a boy, strong for his age. They find journals where so-called Christian men justified the unthinkable. And as those records resurface, the ghosts rise too. Not to haunt, but to remind. Because the exploitation of enslaved teenagers was not an accident. It was a design, a calculated part of the machine that turned humans into commodities. Power was the engine. Silence was the oil that kept it running. But the silence is breaking. Today, descendants of the enslaved walk through the ruins of those plantations. They read the names etched into forgotten ledgers and whisper them out loud. They reclaim what history tried to erase. In classrooms, in documentaries, in poetry and film, a new generation confronts the filth beneath the myth. They ask, what kind of society calls itself civilized while destroying its children? And that question echoes beyond time because it's not just about the past. It's about power itself, about every system that hides behind respectability while feeding on the weak. The legacy of that abuse did not vanish. It seeped into generations, into mistrust, into fear, into the quiet trauma carried through families. Yet alongside the pain came strength, a resilience born from survival. The descendants of those broken teenagers built communities, created art, led revolutions. From their suffering rose music, poetry, and pride. The very culture that slavery tried to crush became the soul of the modern world. And still, the story is not done. Because every time someone says, it wasn't that bad, or it was so long ago, another voice must rise and say, no, this happened. And we remember. We remember the boys who were forced to work before their voices deepened. We remember the girls who were silenced before they could dream. We remember those who never saw freedom, and those who did but carried their pain into old age. We remember because forgetting would be the final act of cruelty. This is not just Black history. This is human history, the record of what happens when power loses its conscience. When greed becomes God. When entire generations are taught that domination is destiny. The plantations are quiet now. The fields grow wild where cotton once ruled. But the wind still carries their voices, faint, fragile, eternal. If you listen closely, you can hear them tell the truth, tell the world what they did to us, and that, perhaps, is the truest form of justice, not revenge but remembrance. Because remembrance is rebellion, and speaking their names is freedom. They were only teenagers, but their endurance changed the world. Their story lives on, not in the chains that bound them, but in the strength that broke them.